Hey everybody, I'm Benoit from RovingBandandMisfits.com, and I'm here on Stuffer Shack today to show you guys how to make modular high ground for your games. I made these pieces here for an Ashes of Athos mod that I ran at Gen Con. They were super quick and simple to make, and so we're going to walk through the steps with you right now on how to make these yourself at home. The first thing that you need is blue foam. This stuff you get at Home Depot or Lowe's or your local hardware store. It's basically a big sheet of insulation that you would put on the side of a house. It comes in 4x8 sheets, so it's pretty big. I cut these down to 1 foot by 1 foot squares, and I have a whole stack of them that I use whenever I need something. The next thing you need is a utility knife, just a couple dollars at Walmart. You're going to need a ruler and a marker. And there's also going to be some paint that you're going to need a little bit later, but we'll get to that in a few minutes. So let's look at the piece of blue foam here, and I'll show you how this works. All right, so you see we have here our piece of blue foam on a cutting mat, and as you can see, it's about 1 foot by 1 foot. It's not straightly cut at all. It's a very rough cut, and that's not a big deal. We're going to start by measuring. We're going to make an L shape, so I'll go 6 inches on either side, and then we'll cut out the L shape. So I'm not going to be very exact about my measurements. I'm not going to worry about it. I'm just going to do it. So 3 inches there. And we'll just come straight down. I'm not going to worry about whether I'm perfectly straight or not. And we'll just come over. It's not a big deal if it doesn't fit perfectly on the grid. Minis can fit, you know, into a little bit of overhang or a little bit of underhang. So now I'm going to cut. I'm not going to worry about that I'm perfectly on the line. I'm not going to worry about that I'm perfectly up and down, or that it's a perfectly straight cut. All these things are not essential because it's supposed to look like rock anyway. So rock is never perfectly perpendicular. So if we want it to look good, just rip it out. If you look there, I have a nice little divot there. Not worried about it. That's fine. Same thing here. Just break that off. It's a little rough around the corner. That's not a big deal. You can see where that divot is. I'm going to leave it. I'm not worried about that at all. So you're going to want to cut up the piece of foam or whatever you have into different sizes. I have one here that I made that's 3x2. I've got one here that's 1x1. And this one is 1x2. So just make a bunch of different sizes and shapes that you want to use. Make L's, make Z's, make squares. Just do a whole bunch of stuff and use up all your foam. Alright, so here's my L-shaped piece that I made before, and it's still way too angular to look good on the battle mat as a piece of rock or just regular terrain, regular high ground. So I'm going to take my utility knife now and I'm going to carve it. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take off these straight edges here. So I'm just going to cut it at an angle, just like that. So now it's nice and rounded. And do that with all these sides here. I'm not really worried about it looking really super good. I'm tearing the foam in some places, and that's fine. It'll look just fine on the finished product. Just going to go around real quick. Alright, I've got these cut off. You can do the bottoms if you want. I'm not going to do that for the sake of time. Then you're going to take the corners and you're going to do the same thing. You're just going to cut them off so it's less angular. Try not to cut my thumb here. That's not what that Band-Aid's for, by the way. I didn't cut myself. I know you're all worried. Alright, so I've got my corners cut off. It's starting to look a lot better now, but I still think these edges are too straight. So I'm just going to take the knife now, and I'm just going to carve a little bit of roughness into it. Really easy, really fast. Okay, so now you can see it's much rougher now. Still maintaining though the basic dimensions. Alright, we're still at about 6 inches by about 6 inches, and you know, this is still about 3 inches. All I'm doing right now is carving some texture into the foam. And this is actually a pretty dull knife, and that's working just fine for me, because when the foam tears, it actually looks pretty good. And it'll look really good when we dry brush it. It really makes the extra tears and the extra, you know, texture that you're carving into it right now pop. So you can see I'm almost done here. It doesn't take very long at all. And I would actually do this a little bit faster with a sharper knife. But as you can see, it's basically done now. And you're going to do that with all your pieces. Do this with this one next. And if you really want to get creative, I have a piece here that I did a little while ago, and I actually carved a little bit of texture into the top. That's not strictly necessary, but if you really want to go crazy with it, maybe some of your smaller pieces, you can do that. Next thing we're going to do is paint it up. All right, so what we're going to do is paint it up now. I got some paper over my cutting mat here. What I use actually is a latex house paint because I use so much of it. I had it mixed up the custom colors, but you can use acrylic craft paint if you want. You just need some white and black, and I will leave the recipes, the ratios that you need to mix them together in the notes to this post. Basically, you're going to do two tones. You're going to do a dark gray, you're going to let it dry, and then you're going to dry brush it with a light gray. Now, normally when I do my Hearst Art stuff, I do 3 tones, but it really isn't worth it to do 3 tones with this. If you want to, you could. You could do an almost white, a gray that's really, it's just almost white as a final dry brush, but it's not necessary. I think they look fine without it. So we're just going to paint this up here. Just using like a 50-cent foam brush that I got at the craft store. Getting in all the cracks. And then once you're all painted up, you're going to let it dry. Alright, so I've painted up my pieces here. They're all dry, and now I'm ready to dry brush the highlight coat on. Like I said before, you can do a third, much lighter highlight coat, but it's not strictly necessary. 2 coats is fine. So we're going to dry brush. The very important thing about a dry brush is that it needs to use a dry brush. That's why it's called dry brushing. You also need a thicker paint. And you'll just get a nice glob of it on there, and you're just going to keep dabbing it until you don't have much left. And then when your brush is fairly dry, you're going to start just brushing it on. You're going to want to get the edges. You can see the edges starting to pop there a little bit, hopefully. You're going to go around all the edges with a dry brush, and you're going to see some of the texture start to pop out. Now, part of the problem with leaving the top flat is that it's really hard to dry brush a flat area. So you're just going to get a dry brush and you're just going to get streaks basically. And that's just going to be the best you can do with this technique that we're using here. We didn't texture the top at all so that a mini can stand on it. So you're just going to have to kind of brush some streaks on there and just call it a day. It's not going to be perfect. It's not going to be real pretty. But it'll be nice enough, and I think your players will really appreciate it. So that's pretty well dry brushed. A third coat would make these edges pop a lot more. So if you want to do that, you can go ahead and do that. I left the formula for the light third coat on the article site, so you can check that out. But dry brushing goes really fast. Once you have the dry brush, you're good to go. All right. Next, we're going to paint the lines onto the pieces. Alright, so we have our pieces all dry brushed up. One thing I forgot to mention earlier was that a wetter dry brush than normal will do really well on these rough edges. So we've got them all dry brushed up here. Got some paint on your hands. That means you're doing a good job. Here's the quick and dirty way of getting lines onto these pieces here. If you want to come up above me here. Alright, so I have them laid out on my battle mat. I made sure that there's no paint, there's no wet paint, because you don't want wet paint on your battle mat. And you can see that this one fits roughly within the grid. We've got a little space here, that's no big deal. But for the most part, we're fitting in. So instead of measuring and trying to get straight lines, all I'm going to do is look at my grid here. I got a spot here, and I'm going to go around and just make lines. Now I'm doing this with a big Sharpie so that you can see really well, but if you want to do it with a dark gray fine point Sharpie, I have one here, that does really well. It shows up very faintly but dark enough that the players can see it. Or you could just use a fine point black Sharpie, that works too. I wouldn't recommend the thick Sharpie like I'm using here, just because it's a little too thick. But it works well so that it shows up on the video for you guys. Alright, so I made my lines all the way around. I'm just going to take a ruler. We're just going to go around and make straight lines. And that's all there is to it. When you're done, you'll have something that looks a lot like this. Beautiful straight lines on it. Nice popping detail with the dry brushing around the edges. And if you make a bunch of them out of that 12 by 12 piece, or a couple of them, you can make something that looks a lot like this over here. That was made in probably about 45 minutes of effort, and all these pieces are modular. You can pick them up and put them down, and you can have an awesome fight on top of high ground terrain. This has been a Happy Clapper production.